What caused South California's two major Ridgecrest earthquakes? Now we have to notice Walker Lane fault system. Why? Because, I guess because the geologists are not talking about it, and it takes about 25% of the pressure of the subducting Pacific plate underneath the North American plate. The other 75% is taken by the San Andreas fault system. So, what caused California's two big earthquakes? This is in GeoIn, and it's from an article republished from National Geographic. And basically they say that we know that before the July 4th 6.4 magnitude rocked Ridgecrest, 13 hours before, we had a 6.5 magnitude earthquake north of Vancouver Island, Canada. Now, why do we tie that into the Ridgecrest? Because that happened again in 2015. They had a 6.2 magnitude, exactly the same location, north of Vancouver Island, Canada, but that caused a Ridgecrest earthquake 24 hours later, mid-size, about 3.5 magnitude. Well, this one now in 2019 took place 13 hours later and was much larger, it was a 6.4. And on July 5th, Friday, the day after July 4th, came the 7.1 magnitude. Of course, that gave the whole day for the geologists to come out and announce that they should expect more earthquakes and aftershocks, be prepared for even bigger earthquakes. They had probabilities, they were spouting out this much of a probability of having fewer or greater than 6.4 and larger than 6.4. Anyway, their probabilities went out the window because a few hours later, not even, about a day and a half later, the 7.1 struck in the same area of Ridgecrest, but on a different fault line. These quakes took place on a section of the Walker Lane fault system that the geologists refer to, but they call it the Eastern California Shear Zone. In the Owens Valley area, the Eastern California Shear Zone, the portion of the Walker Lane that extends south from Owens Valley and continues across the south of the Garlic Fault, across the Mojave Desert to the San Andreas Fault, which is on the west coast near Los Angeles. Okay, so you have the San Andreas connected to the Garland Fault, which is perpendicular to it, which runs east towards Ridgecrest. And that's where the Owens Valley faults. The Eastern California Shear Zone is what we hear them referring to all the time. Eastern California Shear Zone is actually Walker Lane fault system. And that goes all the way up north, northwest, hitting and nudging and bumping up to onto the Cascadia Arc, which of course at the top of that arc is Vancouver Island, Seattle, Vancouver Island. That's why the Vancouver Island earthquakes hit and release their pressure at Ridgecrest. I guess that's where they found it's because it's a volcanic field. It's more low-lying than the Sierra Nevada mountain range, and I guess that's why it hits there and releases energy. It might as well release the energy there because it's got a lot of in that direction, in that location. There's a lot of high-threat volcanoes that the USGS has warned us of. The closest one to Ridgecrest is the Long Valley Caldera supervolcano. And if you see the videos before this one, I explain that in more detail. So, what caused it? Let's see. What National Geographic has to say. The morning of July 4th, we know, the 6.4 rocked Southern California, fracturing roads, sending people fleeing to safety. Thank goodness it was in an area that was low population. Nobody got hurt, not in the 6.4, nor in the 7.1. That was a miracle by itself. Allow me to say it was a miracle. But that was not all the Earth had in store. Less than a day later, we saw the 7.1 trembler. Earthquakes, not unexpected, but the two most recent ones are the largest that struck this area in decades, and they promise to yield fresh clues about how complex this geology is. Now, after the big one, the 7.1, struck on July 5th, the geologists did come to say that these two earthquakes were not on the same fault. There were two different faults in the same area, and they have to start examining what exactly took place, and they have to forecast what quakes each fault can give and what they can give together. Okay, so there are three different scenarios. One has to do with the 6.4 magnitude fault and what it can give as far as earthquakes in the future. The other one has to do with the 7.1 fault and what it can give in the future, and what together they can give in the future. So it's to them it's a very big problem how they're going to do this. So they have to study it, and hopefully they'll come up with something. East California shear zone. East California shear zone is called, and that's a part of the Walker Lane fault system. Okay, they don't talk about Walker Lane. I have not heard anyone talk about Walker Lane, and the more they don't talk about it, the more we talk about it here on this because it's such a huge deal. It's like another San Andreas. It takes up 25% of the pressure. San Andreas doesn't take all the pressure, it takes 75%. As it says here on Wikipedia, the Walker Lane takes up 15 to 25% of the boundary motion between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, the other 75% being taken up by San Andreas fault system to the west. The Walker Lane may represent the incipient major transport zone which could replace the San Andreas as a plate boundary in the future. Now, while earthquakes are not unexpected, the two most recent, the largest that have struck this area in decades. And their complex geology is to be studied by the geologists. These two twin earthquakes struck in what's known as the Eastern California shear zone of the Walker Lane fault system, an area east of the infamous San Andreas, where the Pacific Plate grinds against the North American Plate, creeping northwest roughly 2 inches every year. So that's a lot, if you think about it. The area extends from the southern Mojave Desert up to the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada and into western Nevada. It's crisscrossed by fractures in the earth caused by the movement along the nearby tectonic plate boundary. And we still have not seen the word Walker Lane fault system. Going on, it says the Eastern California shear zone is a really interesting area, says Wendy Bohan, an earthquake geologist at the Incorporated Research Institutes for Seismology, or IRIS for short, IRIS. How is it working? How is it accommodating plate motion? What are going to be the big structures that come out of this millions of years down the road? So what happened? The recent events are what's known as a strike-slip earthquake. And by the way, they can give huge earthquakes. Not just 7 magnitude that we had here, 7.1, they can give 8 and 9s as well. So strike-slip earthquakes, which occur when two blocks of earth shift side by side, grinding past each other. They seem to have occurred along the same set of faults located in an area known as the Little Lake Fault Zone. No deaths or major injuries have been reported. The intensity of the ground movement was quite strong, enough to send goods flying off store shelves and buildings were swaying. The shaking was also widespread, with reports of light ground movements as far as Chico, California, and Phoenix, Arizona. Particular interest in these quakes is that at least the first trembler, the July 4th 6.4, seemed to have simultaneously broken 2 sections of faults that cut across each other at nearly right angles. While such complex quakes are not unheard of, recent research suggests that they may be more common than once believed. Zachary Ross, a geophysicist at the California Institute of Technology, explains, quote, "Historically, the thought has been that earthquakes occurred on individual faults, and then over time, as the data has gotten better and better, we started to realize that there's potential for multiple faults to rupture for single events," end quote. This shift in thinking was propelled by the magnitude 7.3 earthquake that shook Landers, California in 1992. This trembler fractured along at least 5 fault segments. Subsequent earthquakes have revealed similar complex breakage, including the magnitude 7.2 earthquake in 2010 in Baja, California. Ross notes that this latest quake is further evidence that this complexity is common even for small magnitude events. Now, why did these two big earthquakes just strike? In most circumstances, big earthquakes strike in a familiar sequence. There's a large earthquake followed by a series of smaller events. That's because the movement that occurs during a large earthquake causes increased strain in the surrounding region. Earthquakes are the Earth's way of relieving this strain. But in some circumstances, such as a recent pair of earthquakes in California, the Ridgecrest quakes, a relatively large trembler might just be the forerunner for even bigger events. While the difference between 7.1 and 6.4 may seem minor, magnitude is a logarithmic scale. An increase of a unit of magnitude is about 32 times more energy, which means that the second quake released roughly 11 times the energy of the first trembler. Scientists think of these series of earthquakes as the foreshock, the main shock or stronger event, and then the aftershocks, explains Susan Howe, a seismologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. She says, but it's way too simplistic. Every earthquake causes a shift in the landscape, redistributing the strain in the crust, which means all earthquakes could trigger other earthquakes. Quote, whether or not an earthquake itself is an aftershock, you can think of it as a potential earthquake parent, end quote. In other words, it could give birth to other earthquakes. The likelihood that a big earthquake will trigger a larger event is roughly 1 in 20, according to Hugh. That's definitely a low risk, but that 1 in 20 is not zero, she says. Scientists are still untangling the connection between the recent earthquake events. The magnitude 7.1 trembler seemed to break along the northwest-southwest limb of the pair of faults that ruptured earlier, extending farther than the first quake in both directions. Major scientific questions: did part of the fault break and then break again? How did breaks compare in detail? She writes on Twitter, finding the answers to these questions could have important implications for understanding the hazards of these events. This appears to be the clearest case I've seen that did indeed happen. She says that the same fault rupturing more than once is in a short time period, but much work is needed to sort out the details. Well, it was not, I have to correct her, it was not the same fault, it was two different faults crisscrossing each other. Now, what's going to happen next? So far, many more than 1,000 aftershocks have rippled through the region, 80,000. While the frequency and intensity of subsequent tremblers will wane, Southern California likely has more shaking in store. Ross says magnitude 7 is going to produce activity for years. The USGS estimates that over the course of next week, between 240 and 410 earthquakes of magnitude 3 or higher will likely ripple through the region. These are events just large enough to feel if you are positioned close to their epicenter. As for larger earthquakes, the probability becomes increasingly small, but not out of the question. USGS estimates that there's a 24% chance that as many as 2 earthquakes, magnitude 6 or larger, 24% chance of 6 or larger, could strike the next week. So that's a pretty big chance. Next week, 24%, 6 or larger. But as scientists continue to analyze these events, they may adjust those numbers. Such a strong series of aftershocks is not unexpected. Bohan says earthquakes out in the Mojave Desert traditionally have these bigger, robust aftershock sequences. She cautions, however, that all of these probabilities are forecasts and not predictions. No one, despite what some claim, can predict future earthquakes. She likens the difference to weather forecasts, which are an estimate of the probability that something might happen. She says, you would never predict the weather. You can't predict 100% certainty that it will be raining unless it's raining. And earthquakes are very similar. Bohan emphasizes that it's normal to be scared during an earthquake, which can rock the ground like a boat in a river in rough water. But as aftershocks ricochet through Southern California, she suggests people who live in earthquake-prone regions check how prepared they are for the next event. She says, this was a good scenario earthquake. It was the in a fairly unpopulated area, but a lot of people felt it. And Bohan hopes that means that those who experienced it are getting ready for the next one. She says it's okay to be scared, but we also have to be prepared. You noticed two things that were never mentioned in this article by National Geographic, even though there were geologists talking and professors. They did not mention, even though they mentioned the Eastern California Shear Zone, the ECSZ, Eastern California Shear Zone. They did not mention that it was part of the Walker Lane Fault System, number one, that takes 25% of the subducting pressure, and the other 75% is taken by San Andreas. And they did not mention that the Ridgecrest earthquakes were in a volcanic field, the Kosovo volcanic field, which has a magma chamber under there. It deflates, it's rising. They have one of the biggest geothermal plants in the country there, and the naval base of China Lake, the China Lake naval base there. They did not mention that it's a volcanic field. They didn't mention anything having to do with the geothermal activity, the magma chamber, and deformation of the area. Quake swarms may have, that may be tectonic earthquakes, or they may be volcanic earthquakes. They didn't mention that whatsoever. I'm really astonished. And today I have some shopping to do, but today I plan on writing a letter to US Geological Survey and submitting it to them by internet, email, and see if they'll answer me, because I don't understand why they're coming out and saying anything when they only do half truths. I mean, when you're going to talk about something, please include the basic information that we can get at least from other geologists and the internet. My goodness, Wikipedia. I mean, don't belittle us like that. We're grown people, we have families, we have children. We may have elderly people that we have to look after, know how to evacuate them, know what's going on. Or maybe babies that we have to take care of. And you can't keep some information. You're telling us to get ready, but you're not giving us all the information. That it may be a volcanic issue here. That it may be a volcanic thing, a volcanic event, like they had in Kilauea last year. Okay, so I'll leave links below for you for this. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.